Yesterday, a longtime viewer of this channel reminded me that I hadn't made a video about advanced analytics in a while. And I looked back on my channel history and it's pretty much true. Now, I knew that for this video, I wanted to talk about defensive metrics, but I wasn't sure where to start because I think I will make more videos like these in the future. I kind of say that all the time, but then there's a part of me that's like, you probably won't do it. So in this video, I'm going to talk about one of the most commonly used advanced defensive metrics that you see not only amongst the very hardcore fans, but even in those articles you see on ESPN or even the website like Fansided. A lot of people use the on-off defensive rating. And although I'm going to start off talking about this, I think the concepts I talk about in this video are going to apply to defensive metrics in general and hopefully just change the way you think a little bit about how players are potentially represented in defensive metrics. But before we get into that video, gotta give a shout out to the sponsor of this video, SeatGeek. SeatGeek is the best way to buy tickets to sporting events, concerts, stand-up comedy shows, whatever you're interested in. And there's a lot of cool features of the app that I've talked about at length. My favorite, like always, is the fact that for a lot of these stadiums that you go to, it actually can give you a preview of your seat, of like the vantage point from where you're going to be sitting in the app itself before you buy the tickets. Because for me, in my experience, that's always been the biggest frustration is when I buy a ticket, I get there, and then my view was just nothing like what I imagined in my head. If that sounds interesting to you, you should download the SeatGeek app right now. You can use my promo code MDJ for $20 off of your first purchase. Okay, now on to the video. You will very often hear people say when they're talking about teams and players that, for instance, X team is X points per 100 possessions better when X player is on the floor as compared to when X player is not on the floor. This is otherwise known as the on-off defensive rating. Defensive rating is essentially how many points a team gives up per 100 possessions, and in the context of an on-off number, that basically means how does this team do defensively as a unit when this player is on the floor versus when this player is off the floor. For instance, I've often seen people use this stat to compare two players on the same team in trying to differentiate who is the better player. Now, on paper, there doesn't seem to be anything wrong with stats like these until you consider that not every player on a given team spends equal proportions of their playing time with the other players. Let me give an example with the Pacers just to make it easy to understand. So currently, the Pacers defensive rating is 102.3 when Miles Turner is on the floor, and it's the exact same rating with him off the floor. However, when Domantas Sabonis is on the floor, the Pacers have a 100.4 defensive rating, and when he's off the floor, the Pacers have a 103.5 defensive rating. And remember, defensive rating is how many points you give up per 100 possessions. The lower the number, the better. Turner and Sabonis have both played 1,008 minutes exactly, which on a side note, it really brings into the question who's the best center in Indiana. But anyways, here's a question for you guys. Can you draw the conclusion from this stat that Sabonis is a better overall defender than Miles Turner? The answer is no, you cannot. First off, the difference here is very small, especially once you factor in that this is only a 20-game sample size. For instance, 2 good defensive games from Turner and 2 bad defensive games from Sabonis could probably flip this stat on its head. Now, the stat is not negligible, but it's also not very significant yet. And second of all, even if let's say the differences were much larger, you still cannot draw the conclusion that Sabonis is a better defender than Turner because there are many factors that influence this stat that have nothing to do with Sabonis or Turner. For example, Miles Turner has played 411 out of his 1,008 minutes with Bojan Bogdanovic, while Sabonis has only played 230 out of his 1,008 minutes with Bogdanovic. Now, it's no secret to anyone that has ever watched Bogdanovic, whether it's on the Pacers or the Wizards or the Nets, that he is not a good defender. He never has been a good defender. And if Miles Turner is spending almost twice as much of his playing time on the court playing alongside Bogdanovic, then it logically reasons that while Bogdanovic is probably dragging down both Turner and Sabonis' defensive rating, he's dragging down Miles Turner's defensive rating more so than Sabonis's. And if we translate this to the basketball court, it means that there are possessions where Bogdanovic gets blown past by quicker wing players in isolation and gives up easy shots, which often have nothing to do with Turner or Sabonis' defensive ability. Yet from a defensive rating perspective, the Pacers still gave up those points with Turner or Sabonis on the floor or off the floor. So you can imagine doing this kind of analysis with not only Bogdanovic, but every other player on a roster. And on top of that, I use Bogdanovic as an example because he's obviously uncontroversially a bad defender. Most players, it's not that easy trying to figure out how good they are defensively. For instance, what are we to make of the fact that Miles Turner spends a lot more time on the court with Darren Collison, whereas Sabonis spends a lot more time on the court with Corey Joseph? Does this difference help Turner or Sabonis' argument for best defender on the Pacers? Or actually, here's an easier way to phrase that question. Who is the better defender, Darren Collison or Corey Joseph? Does anyone have an answer to that question? Can Pacers fans even confidently answer that question? I mean, I'm speaking off the top of my head. Like in my mind, Darren Collison and Corey Joseph are both, average, slightly above average defenders. And as if it weren't complicated enough, here's another thing to consider. Miles Turner starts games, Sabonis comes off the bench, even though they play the same amount of minutes. And this, of course, is why Miles Turner plays more minutes alongside fellow starter Darren Collison, and Sabonis plays more minutes alongside Corey Joseph, who also comes off the bench. So therefore, Miles Turner is more often playing against the opposing team's starting lineups and the other team's best center. Not always true, but on average, it seems safe to assume that's the case. But then again, could you assume that Sabonis is playing alongside worse defensive players since he's playing alongside players that come off of Indiana's bench? Are bench players on average worse defensively than starters? These are all very difficult questions that vary from team to team and player to player. And again, so far, nothing we've talked about is really taken into consideration when you hear a stat like Sabonis or the Pacers are X points better or X points worse when Sabonis or Turner is on or off the floor. And just to be clear, I am not saying that these stats don't matter. In fact, I think this is actually one of the defensive metrics that is even worth looking at, because there are instances where I think stats like these do tell a pretty good story. For example, last season, when Andre Roberson went down with an injury, OKC's defensive rating essentially dropped from number 2 in the league to, I believe, somewhere around league average. And of course, that was reflected very heavily in Andre Roberson's on-off numbers, even when he was healthy. So in that instance, even though there might be a lot of factors as well, such as when Andre Roberson's on the floor, maybe he shares a lot of that time with Paul George, which makes his life easier. He probably plays a lot of minutes alongside Steven Adams instead of OKC's backup center, which helps him. But even if you factored those things in, the discrepancy between OKC's defense with Roberson and without Roberson is so big, and with a good enough sample size, that you can confidently say that Roberson is a primary reason why their defense dropped. All I'm saying with this Turner and Sabonis example is that it's actually more common that you don't see these big statistical differences. And when you don't see those big differences, you really have to start thinking some of the other factors that we've talked about so far in this video and whether or not those are driving those differences. Well, that's it for today's video. I told you it was gonna be very abstract, very weird. And because I know I'm probably gonna get questions on Twitter or something about this, the stats that I use in this video with the on and off numbers, you can find all those on NBA.com/stats. It's the NBA's own database. It's public. It's free. You can go on there and tinker around with all the tools that they have. But I do hope that you enjoy this video. I hope that you at least learned something. I hope this makes you think about basketball a little bit differently. I hope you subscribe to this channel if you haven't already and you're a basketball fan. I hope she texts me back. What? Sorry, getting sidetracked. Oh, what? What?